you typically see tables like this, filling up these papers, showing you caloric expenditure in terms of different hunter-gatherer populations, different types of activities that they might have been engaging in, and it's all well and good. But I don't think it's good enough in terms of providing recommendations. So what I wanted to do was instead look over and synthesize exercise program variables by looking at the physical activity patterns of extinct and extant hunter-gatherers and trying to draw out those variables. So how often were they exercising, or how often were they physically active? How much were they physically active? What was the sort of range that they were active over? How long were they physically active for? What duration did they engage in? How hard was the physical activity that they engaged in? What sort of intensity of effort did they put forth into it? What was the types of loading they experienced as well? It's difficult to actually pick that out, but we can look at the types and modalities that they were engaged in as well to give us more of an idea of what types and modalities of exercise we potentially should be taking part in. And ultimately, the question I'm asking is, what effect does the manipulation of these variables actually have on physical fitness? Because that's the information that we're interested in terms of providing recommendations. So let's start off with looking at other primates then, our closest cousins. So if you look at arboreal quadrupeds, like Old World monkeys, New World monkeys, small-bodied quadrupedal mammals, their frequency of exercise tends to be very, very seasonal. So depending upon the season, they will be more or less active. It depends highly on the availability of food, the availability of mates, so on and so forth. But the types and modalities of exercise they engage in are very, very consistent. So they spend a lot of time clambering, climbing, sitting, walking, running, bounding, brachiating, which is swinging from arm to arm. But actually, if you look at the volume of activity they engage in, it's actually quite low. It wasn't anywhere near as high as I imagined it would be. Has any of you guys been to the zoo and gone to watch the monkeys and sat there wondering why they're all asleep? Because they actually spend a lot of time sleeping. They spend a lot of time sitting around, standing, not really doing a lot, just resting. In fact, monkeys are pretty sedentary, so they should all be obese and unhealthy and dying, but funnily enough, they're not. They tend to spend a lot of time sitting, and apparently this is killing us. So today, you guys are fucked. I mean, you've been sitting all day, so you're going to be dead by the end of today. Well, by the end of Sunday. I mean, you guys have got 3 days worth of this, so I feel for you guys. I'm gonna stand at the back for the rest of the days, just in case. Anyway, you see the point I'm making. I'm being a bit facetious here. If we look at other primate species as well, if we look at different types of species, we do see there's some individual variation, but actually they do spend a considerable amount of time just resting. They spend a lot of time just chilling out, feeding, sitting, socializing, not that much time actually engaged in physical activity, or certainly not vigorous physical activity that we would expect. Okay, but what about the bigger apes? So the bigger-bodied apes, the great apes, like orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, they tend to have a slightly larger range, which is reflective of their body size. But again, we tend to see that they spend a lot of time engaged in certain types of activities for the small amount of time that they are actually active. They do spend a lot of time sitting around feeding, but again, that might actually be related to their gut physiology. But in essence, other primates tend to be pretty lazy, pretty sedentary. They spend a lot of time sitting. Interestingly as well, they actually spend little time socializing and playing. Like, I would have expected them to spend a lot more time playing. You know, one of the kind of tenets of paleo fitness is that we should be playing, not exercising. It surprised me that they spend very little time actually engaged in those types of activities. Okay, but what about extinct hunter-gatherers? Because obviously other primates, you know, they're evolutionarily close to us, but they're not us. What about early hunter-gatherers, the extinct hunter-gatherer populations? What do we get if we look over their remains? So this is where I kind of expected to spend a bit of time delving into the literature, looking at what the skeletal remains actually showed, and trying to figure out what frequency of activity they engaged in, how much they engaged in it, what types of loadings they experienced, and be able to pull out these ideas that they were super fit, super healthy, and they were really physically active. And as Robert Germain and his colleagues have said, it actually turns out it's a bit of a holy grail. It tends to be something that's very difficult to find. In fact, when I actually looked into the literature, it felt a bit like it was doing this back at me. Go.
Start in your general direction. Your mother was a hamster, and your father smelt of elderberry.
for those of you who love Monty Python. But it felt a bit like that. I started looking into the literature, and it was very, very difficult to actually draw anything out. So even, gone too far ahead then. Even 2 decades ago, researchers were saying that there's no clear physical activity pattern or level that's specific to extinct hunter-gatherer populations. It varies massively by geography, varies massively by culture, massively by technological advancement. We tend to find that even in different populations, sometimes there is sexual dimorphism, sometimes there isn't, sometimes there is sexual division of labour, sometimes there isn't. So it's difficult to draw out gender-specific recommendations, particularly from that. What's interesting as well is when you actually look at the skeletal remains, the skeletal robusticity remains, musculoskeletal markers of loading, we tend to see that actually some studies show that hunter-gatherer populations experience just as much physical loading as agricultural populations. Some seem to experience more, indicating they're potentially more active, but some actually experience less. And also some studies indicate that there's not much of a difference between hunter-gatherer populations and modern populations as well. So it makes it very difficult to actually say that they were more physically active. Also, it's really difficult to say what types or modes of exercise they actually engaged in. You know, if you look at these exercise programs given out by the paleo fitness experts, they typically involved primal movement patterns. We don't know what they were. If we actually look at the studies, the musculoskeletal stress markers that we look at, which we would hope indicate what types of loading they experience, don't always tie up with cultural remains. They don't always tie up with the types of technology we find with them. So it's very difficult to say that they were actually engaged in one particular set of activities or one particular type of activity, because the two don't tie up. Another interesting point as well is that when you look into some of the sports medicine literature, over the last few years, we've started to look at different types of changes in skeletal geometry in response to different types of loading patterns. So they've compared like sprinters, endurance runners, hockey players, to try and differentiate between the types of skeletal geometry that we see in those engaged in endurance running, those engaged in intermittent sprinting, or activities that involve change of direction. And some studies show that there are good correlations between certain types of skeletal geometry and these activities. But then others don't support that link as well. So it makes it very difficult to look back at the early human populations and say, well, they must have been endurance running, or they must have been doing interval training, or that, well, not training, but they must have been intermittently sprinting, and so on and so forth. So were we engaged in the types of activities that we typically romantically associate with hunter-gatherers? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. Should we be doing it? Maybe, being a bit facetious, we should be doing something like this. Because, and I just love the wording in this study, so I wanted to put the quote in here. A study was looking at the skeletal lesions in a group of Neanderthals, and interestingly, the skeletal lesions in this group of Neanderthals were very similar to those seen in rodeo riders. So they concluded that the similarity to rodeo lesion distribution suggests frequent close encounters with large ungulates unkindly disposed to the humans involved. So maybe we should be doing a bit more rodeo riding, because clearly that's what we did. Maybe not. Okay, I'm not going to read through that quote, but if any of you are interested in doing a bit more reading around the folly of looking at this type of literature and trying to draw these types of conclusions, Mayer and colleagues have a great review paper talking about these limitations, so it's well worth looking at. One thing I will pull out though, and this is another big point, is that it's really difficult to look at skeletal remains and actually draw out what adult physical activity patterns were. Because a lot of the time, the skeletal remains we get and the types of geometry that we see in those skeletal remains actually reflect childhood activity patterns during the formative years, when the bones are far more susceptible to adapting to those types of stresses. So it makes it even more difficult to actually draw out these patterns. Okay. What about our extant hunter-gatherers? So again, I wanted to look at extant hunter-gatherers, those that are still available to study, look at these variables and try and figure out what produces this wonderful romantic notion of the super fit, super healthy hunter-gatherer, caveman, cavewoman. Okay, so let's start off going through each of these variables then. So in terms of frequency, hunter-gatherer populations do tend to be physically active on most days. But when we talk about physical activity, like I said at the start, I want to differentiate between general or occupational physical activity and what we typically consider to be exercise. And most of the physical activity that they engage in, we wouldn't really look at and consider to be exercise, or at least of sufficient vigorousness or intensity of effort to actually be considered exercise. More like chores. Imagine a day of housework, a bit of hoovering, a bit of ironing, maybe a bit of yard work. Yard, that sounds weird. I should have said garden. Sorry, I'm British. But that's typically what you tend to see in those studies. I mean, even if you subscribe to the idea that the males of hunter-gatherer populations typically engage in endurance running or persistence hunting type activities, they typically, oh, I didn't even press that then. They typically only involve themselves in exercise, or certainly endurance type exercise, maybe every 3 to 5 days when they were successful on their hunts. It's more difficult to determine when they were unsuccessful. But typically they were engaged in physical activity on most days, maybe more vigorous intensity activity every few days or so. Oh. Okay, but what about the volume of that activity? Okay, so they were doing physical activity, but how much of it were they actually doing? Well, as I've said, we're bipedal, and the types of walking patterns that you see in hunter-gatherer populations typically allow them to expand their range. They don't typically go for a walk and follow one route. They tend to follow random power law distributions when they're foraging to try and increase their range and maximize their yield in terms of foraging. You typically find that, although if you look back at kind of the review articles by Lauren Cordain and James O'Keefe and those guys, they'll pull the magic number or magic range of 6 kilometers to 16 kilometers a day was the typical range for hunter-gatherers. That tends to be based on like one study in the Hadza. When you look at other studies, you typically see that actually they don't tend to move around anywhere near as much as that. Every few weeks or so, they might move camp or they might move on from the position they're in, but typically, whatever location they're in, they maybe only move, or certainly some populations, up to around 2.5 miles around that in terms of range. It's, you know, they're not walking 16 kilometers a day, as we typically were told by the academics who are writing these articles. If you look at the body of literature, it tends to be highly variable. In fact, some studies show that they spend, you know, maybe 70 to 80 hours of their waking day just resting, sitting around, being sedentary, all the stuff that's killing us apparently, but somehow doesn't kill them. It's a bit like the French paradox. You know, the French eat lots of saturated fat, but they have low heart disease. So obviously the saturated fat that we're eating is killing us, but it's not killing them somehow. It's probably the red wine. For these guys, it's probably the berries and, you know, other stuff that they eat. Don't know. Anyway. So I decided, and Greg was talking to me earlier about this, he said, I'm a cautious type, I like to have data. So what I did was I went to all the studies and I pulled out the data and I ran some stats on it myself. So I went through and pulled out all of the articles that I could find that had actually recorded physical activity levels, i.e. the ratio of total energy expenditure to resting metabolic rate, to look and actually compare hunter-gatherer populations, agricultural populations, and modern populations, and also looked at comparing it to this Paleolithic standard that Boyd Eaton and colleagues actually kind of defined as a physical activity level back in 2003. And hopefully this will be coming out in a paper that I've been invited to publish in Journal of Evolution and Health. But when I ran the stats on it, although there are slight differences between hunter-gatherer agricultural populations and modern populations, they're a little bit more active in terms of the physical activity levels data that we can look at. It's not significantly different, you know. Whether it's big enough to actually have a meaningful effect on their health and fitness, I don't know. But at least when we look at the data, it's certainly not statistically significant. What I think is more interesting, though, is actually the intensity of activity that they're engaged in. So one of the things that does seem to differ between their populations and our populations is the fact that actually they do spend some of their day involved in very high intensity activity. So when you look at the distribution of the vigorousness or the difficulty or how hard the activity they're actually engaged in across the course of a day, you see that they spend quite a lot of time engaged in very sedentary or light activities. Certainly in the populations looked at in these papers, you see that the light grey at the bottom of the graph indicates that they spent a considerable portion of the day sedentary or engaged in light activities. Now, this was really interesting as well, though, is that when you differentiate between day and night in men and women, you might not be able to see it on the graph so much, but at night, the men are engaged in maybe a few minutes of very, very vigorous activity, but not the women. So I leave that to you guys to speculate as to what they might be doing. I know what I think they might be doing. They've gone out for an interval session in the middle of the night, of course. But anyway, we typically find that they spend a lot of time in, some low-intensity activity or being very sedentary. If you look at the average speeds at which they move around at, Dr. Kim Hill's observations in the Archie men typically showed that they were walking around at an average of about 1.5 to 3 kilometers an hour. Occasionally, they would involve themselves in short bursts of sprinting, particularly when hunting or foraging. But I mean, 1.5 to 3 kilometers an hour, that's a really slow stroll. That's not even kind of average walking speed for most populations nowadays. That's taking it pretty easy. I mean, even when you look at the studies on persistence hunting, the average speed at which they move at is 6.1 kilometers an hour. Now, that's a bit of a route march, but that's not a jog. That's still walking, just at a pretty quick pace. But what it indicates is that they were probably involved in some high-intensity activity and then a lot of low intensity or sedentary type activity. And even in children as well. We see that in the child populations, they spend a lot of time engaged in very low intensity activity and then occasionally very high intensity activity. And this is what I think might be missing from what most modern populations are engaged in. So what about the types and modalities of exercise that they were engaged in? So we know they were doing high-intensity activity, but what types of activity were they engaged in to produce that high intensity?